6 years is a long time to pretend someone is dead. Not literally. Maren knew he was alive. She'd seen his name in the papers twice. Once when the feds tried to build a case against his family's shipping operation and couldn't make anything stick, and once when he bought out a waterfront property in Charleston that everyone in the city had opinions about. She'd read both articles standing at the kitchen counter while her coffee went cold, and then she'd folded the newspaper and put it in the recycling and gone upstairs to braid her daughter's hair. That was how she survived it. You fold the newspaper, you walk upstairs, you learn the particular shape of the life you built without him. She owned a small cafe on the corner of Whitmore and Fifth, the kind of place with exposed brick and mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu that her daughter, Blythe, liked to redraw on Saturday mornings with the colored chalk Maren kept in a jar by the register. Blythe was 6 now. She had her mother's stubborn chin and her father's eyes, though Maren had spent 3 years pretending not to notice that. The cafe was called Groundwork. It had 12 tables and a back window that faced an alley where a calico cat showed up every morning at 7:15 without fail. Maren had named the cat Wednesday, even though she showed up every day of the week, because Maren found that funny and there was nobody around to tell her the joke didn't land. It was a good life, a quiet one. She had her regulars, Mr. Hensley, who ordered a plain drip coffee and sat with his crossword for exactly 40 minutes, the young woman from the law firm, 2 blocks over, who always looked like she was 2 emails away from crying, the retired couple who came in on Tuesdays and Thursdays and split a blueberry scone without speaking to each other, just reading their separate books in a companionable silence Maren privately envied. She had her Thursday evening yoga class she went to maybe twice a month but still counted as hers. She had her daughter's laugh, which was the loudest noise in any room Blythe walked into. She had enough. She told herself that on a regular basis, and most days she believed it. The morning it changed started like every other one. Maren unlocked the cafe at 5:50, turned on the espresso machine, and checked the dry erase schedule on the back wall. Her morning barista, Tomas, was coming in at 6. Her part-time help, a college sophomore named Greta, whose real name was Marguerite, but who corrected no one, was opening the pastry case at 6:15. Blythe was at school until 3, after which she'd come straight here and do her homework at the corner table by the window, the one with the wonky leg that Maren kept meaning to fix with a shim and kept forgetting about. Normal. Predictable. Safe. She was grinding beans when Tomas came in and started talking about the news. Some kind of disturbance the night before, over on the east side. Police response. He'd seen something on his phone and mentioned it the way people mention things before their first cup of coffee. Loosely, without structure, just noise to fill the silence. Maren nodded and kept grinding. She didn't think about Corvin Steele until he walked through her door at 7:42. She knew his steps before she raised her eyes. That was the part that humiliated her, that some deeply stupid part of her body recognized him before her brain caught up. She heard the bell over the door, heard footsteps, and her shoulders tightened the way they used to when she was waiting for him to come home late, listening for the sound of him in the hallway. She looked up. 6 years had changed him. He was leaner, not the way that looked healthy, but the way that said something had been eating at him for a while. There was a cut at his temple, recently stitched, still a little swollen at the edges. He was wearing a dark jacket that probably cost more than her espresso machine, and he stood in the doorway of her cafe like a man who had walked into the wrong place and knew it and wasn't going to leave anyway. He looked at her. She looked at him. Tomas said, from somewhere very far away, "Can I help you?" Corvin didn't answer. He was still looking at Maren, and his expression was something she didn't have a name for, something between recognition and pain, and something else she couldn't read, something new that hadn't been there before. "Maren," he said. Just that. Like the word cost him something. She put the portafilter down on the counter very carefully because her hands had gone unreliable, and she said, "We're not open yet." She made him wait. Not long, 10 minutes, until Greta arrived and Tomas had the machine going, and the first 2 regulars had come in, and there was enough buffer of normalcy in the room that she trusted herself to speak. Then she took off her apron, told Tomas she'd be in the back for a few minutes, and walked to the small office behind the kitchen where she kept her paperwork, and a folding chair and a framed photo of Blythe from last Halloween, dressed as a bumblebee. Corvin followed her without being invited. She'd half expected that. She left the door open. She stood near her desk with her arms crossed, not because she was cold, but because it was the most solid thing she could do with her body, and she looked at him and said, "You need to tell me why you're here." "I know," he said. He looked around the small office. The stacked invoices, the bumblebee photo, the motivational calendar she'd gotten free from a supplier and never replaced because she kept forgetting it was there. Something in his face shifted when he saw the photo, but he didn't say anything about it. Not yet. "I need your help." "No, Maren, you don't get to come in here and just say my name and expect that to work," she said. Her voice was steadier than she felt, and she was proud of that. "You don't get to show up with stitches in your head and stand in my cafe and—" She stopped, breathed. "What happened?" he told her. It took about 8 minutes. She didn't interrupt. He'd been in the middle of something the night before. He was vague about the specifics, and she didn't push, because she'd learned a long time ago that the specifics were never things she wanted to know. And it had gone wrong. There were people looking for him, not law enforcement. The other kind. He'd been hit by debris from a car accident that wasn't an accident, and he'd driven himself to the nearest urgent care, and the nearest urgent care had been 3 blocks from groundwork, and he'd seen her name on the sign while they were stitching his head, and he'd spent 2 hours sitting in a plastic chair deciding whether to come here. "So," she said when he was done, "you need to hide, just for a few days, until I can make some arrangements. You want to hide in my cafe." He looked at her steadily. "I need somewhere they won't look because they don't know about me. Because I kept it that way," he said quietly. "On purpose." She stood there for a long moment. The coffee machine hummed on the other side of the wall. She could hear Greta's voice, bright and a little too loud, explaining the difference between a latte and a flat white to someone who probably hadn't asked. "You have 6 hours," Maren said. "My daughter comes here after school." He nodded, like that was answer enough. "There's a cot in the storage room," she said. "Don't touch anything." She walked out before he could say thank you. She got through the morning on muscle memory. It was a Tuesday, which meant the retired couple with the scone and a standing order from the insurance office down the street, and Mr. Hensley with his crossword, and a burst of foot traffic around 9 that kept her hands busy enough that she couldn't think too carefully about the man sitting in her storage room. She thought about him anyway. That was the thing nobody told you about grief. And she had grieved him, even though he was alive, because you could grieve someone who was still breathing, grieve the version of your life that didn't happen. Nobody told you that grief could just sit in the back of your chest for years, very quietly, until the thing you were grieving walked into your cafe at 7:42 in the morning, and suddenly it wasn't quiet anymore. She'd been 24 when she met Corvin Steele. She'd been working at a restaurant downtown, 2 nights a week, putting herself through her last semester of culinary school. He'd come in with a group of men in good suits, sat at the best table, ordered half the menu. He'd sent a glass of wine to the kitchen for the person who made the pasta, and when she'd come out to accept it, because she'd figured it was some older man who wanted to feel generous, it had been him. He was 31, and he had gray eyes, and he'd said, "You understand salt," like that was the most important thing he'd ever learned about a person. She'd laughed at him. He'd liked that. For 8 months, she'd told herself it was casual. For 8 months, she'd been slowly, thoroughly, completely in love with him and pretending otherwise. He had that effect. He made you feel like the room reorganized itself around you when he walked in, and then he'd disappear for 3 days, and you'd remind yourself that you barely knew him and you were being foolish, and then he'd come back and it would start over. She found out about the family business on a Thursday night when a man she'd never seen before had come to the restaurant looking for him, and the way the other servers had moved out of the way, quickly, quietly, without anyone saying a word, had told her everything she needed to know. She'd asked Corvin about it that same night. He hadn't lied to her. That was the part that made it worse. He'd looked at her across the table, very calmly, and explained that his family ran certain operations, that he had certain responsibilities, and that he understood if she didn't want to continue. She'd left. She'd found out she was pregnant 6 weeks later. She had not told him. By noon, her resolve had developed cracks. Not about hiding him. She wasn't going to kick an injured man into the street. That was just not who she was. But about the other thing. The thing she'd been carrying for 6 years. The weight of a secret that got heavier every time Blythe smiled at her with those gray eyes. She brought him food at noon. A sandwich and a coffee, because she wasn't going to let anyone in her care go hungry, not even him. He was sitting on the cot, jacket off, looking at his phone with the particular stillness of a man who was trying to manage a situation from a very limited position. He looked up when she came in. "Thank you," he said. "Don't." She set the plate on a box of supplies. "It's just food." She should have left. She stood there anyway. "You built something good here," he said. He wasn't looking at his phone anymore. He was looking at her the same way he'd always looked at her, like he was actually paying attention, which was rare enough in the world that she'd never quite gotten immune to it. "I built something," she said. "Yes, Maren." He put the phone down. "The photo in your office." Her chest went very still. "In the Halloween costume," he said. "How old is she?" She could have lied. She'd had 6 years of practice not answering this specific question, not to him, not to anyone who might have carried the answer back to him. But he was sitting right in front of her with stitches in his temple, and the lie was right there, and she opened her mouth, and couldn't do it. 6, she said. He looked at her for a long time. "Maren, don't." Her voice had gone tight. "Don't do the math out loud. I don't want to hear you do the math out loud." He was quiet. And then, very softly, "Is she mine?" She looked at the shelf above his head, industrial-sized sugar, extra napkins, a spare bag of dark roast. She looked at those things and breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth and said, "Yes." The silence that followed was the longest she'd ever sat in. She told him everything in pieces over the course of the afternoon, in the spaces between customers and supply checks and the small, manageable crises of running a cafe on a Tuesday. She told him she'd found out after she left, that she'd made a decision, deliberate and clear-eyed, to not bring him into Blythe's life when his life was the way it was. That she didn't regret it, that she didn't want him to think she was asking for anything. He listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't defend himself, didn't try to manage her. He just listened. That had always been one of the things that made him dangerous. "I'm not angry," he said when she finished. "I didn't ask if you were angry." "I know. I'm telling you anyway." He paused. "I'm not angry. I don't know what I am, but it's not that." She looked at him across the storage room. "You should know she's fine. She's good. She's the most remarkable person I've ever met, and I'm not saying that because I'm her mother. I'm saying it because it's true. She reads above her grade level, and she has opinions about fonts, and she once negotiated a later bedtime by citing the importance of REM sleep cycles, which she'd read about in a book about the brain that she found at the library." Something moved across his face that she didn't have a word for. "She sounds like you," he said. "She has your eyes," Maren said before she could stop herself. At 2:50, Maren asked Greta to stay until 4 and walk to the school herself. She didn't usually do this. Blythe was old enough to walk the 4 blocks on her own, and proud of it, but Maren needed the air. She needed to be outside her own building for 15 minutes before she brought her daughter back to it. She stood on the sidewalk outside the school and watched the doors open and the small people flood out, and she found Blythe in under 10 seconds the way she always did, like there was a tether. Blythe was wearing the green backpack that was almost as big as she was, and talking animatedly to a girl Maren didn't recognize, gesturing with both hands the way she always did when she was explaining something she cared about. She looked up and saw Maren and her face went bright. "Mom!" She ran over. She crashed into Maren's arms like she hadn't seen her in weeks, even though it had been 7 hours. She did this every day. Maren held on every time. "Hey, Bug," Maren said into the top of her head. "You came to get me." Blythe pulled back and looked up at her with those gray eyes. "What happened?" "Nothing happened. I wanted to walk with you." Blythe looked at her with the focused skepticism of a 6-year-old who had correctly identified most of her mother's tells. You always say that when something happened. You're too perceptive, Maren said. It's a problem. Blythe grinned. I know. She brought Blythe in through the front of the cafe, sat her at the corner table with the wonky leg, got her a hot chocolate and a slice of the lemon cake she liked, and told her to start her reading homework. Blythe, who genuinely loved homework in a way that Maren found baffling and wonderful, opened her book immediately. Maren went to the back. She stood outside the storage room door for a moment. Then she opened it. He was still there. He'd folded the paper wrapper from the sandwich and stacked his coffee cup neatly, which was so precisely the kind of thing he would do that it made her feel slightly insane. She's here, Maren said. She's in the front. I need you to stay back here. He nodded. Then, okay, Corvin. I mean it, he said. I'm not going to push. This is your house. She looked at him for a long moment. When this is over, whatever this is, we need to have a real conversation about what happens next. I'm not going to pretend this information doesn't exist. Neither am I, he said. Okay, she exhaled. Okay, she went back out front. She refilled Mr. Hensley's coffee, even though he hadn't asked. She wiped down the counter. She checked on Blythe, who was reading with her whole body inclined toward the book, one leg tucked underneath her on the chair. At 4:15, Blythe looked up and said, Mom, can I get more lemon cake? You can have half a piece. That's the same as one piece if you cut it thick enough. Where did you learn to argue like that? Blythe looked innocent. Books. Maren cut her a generous half-piece and put it on a small plate and walked it over. She was setting it down when she heard the storage room door open, heard Corvin's footsteps, heard him stop. She looked up. He was standing in the doorway between the back and the front of the cafe. He was looking at Blythe. Blythe looked up from her book. They looked at each other, the 6-year-old and the man, across the length of the cafe. Hi, Blythe said. The way she said it had no wariness in it at all, just her normal directness of a child who had never been taught to be suspicious of strangers. Are you a friend of my mom's? Corvin was very still. I used to be, he said. His voice had done something, gone rough at the edges, and Maren saw him work to smooth it over. A long time ago. Blythe considered this. What's your name? Corvin. That's a bird name, Blythe said with academic interest. It is, he agreed. Ravens are smart, Blythe said. They can recognize faces. We learned about it. I know, he said. I've always liked that about them. Blythe looked at him for another moment with those gray eyes, his eyes, in her small face, and then she nodded, satisfied with whatever she'd concluded, and went back to her book. Corvin looked at Maren. Maren was already looking at him. Had been looking at him since the moment he'd stepped into the room, watching his face do something she'd never seen it do in the 8 months she'd known him, something unguarded and enormous and entirely undone. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. There wasn't anything to say yet. There was too much to say, which was the same as nothing, for now. He left at 7 after close. His car was parked 2 streets over. He'd made calls in the afternoon, quiet ones from the storage room, and whatever arrangement he needed to make had apparently been made. He stopped at the door. I'd like to see her again, he said, properly, when it's safe and she knows who I am. He looked at Maren. I'm not demanding anything. I just want you to know that's what I want, so you can think about it. Maren leaned against the counter. The cafe was empty, all the chairs upended on the tables the way she liked to leave them, the espresso machine cooling, the chalkboard menu in Blythe's handwriting from last Saturday, a small crown she'd drawn next to the hot chocolate listing. I'll think about it, she said. He nodded. He put his hand on the door. Corvin, she said. He stopped. What you said earlier about keeping me out of it. On purpose, she looked at him steadily. I need to know if that's still true, if this was just. She searched for the word, convenient, because I was 3 blocks away. He turned back. He looked at her for a long moment, and the thing about Corvin was that he never looked at anything carelessly. He looked at her the way he'd always looked at her, like he was actually paying attention, like she was the most interesting thing in the room, which had always been both the problem and the point. I've driven past this street 4 times in the last year, he said. I never stopped because I thought you were better off. A beat. I was probably right. I just don't know if I can stay right anymore. He pushed the door open and walked out. Maren stood in her empty cafe for a while after that. She listened to the city settle into evening. She thought about a lot of things, about Blythe's face when she'd looked at him, that calm, assessing look, ravens are smart, and about her own face 6 years ago, walking away from a table in a restaurant, not knowing yet what she was carrying. She thought about what it meant to build a life, carefully, brick by brick, and what happened when a piece of the original foundation showed back up. She didn't have an answer. She wasn't sure. Answers were the point. She pushed off the counter, picked up her keys, turned off the lights. Tomorrow morning, she'd be back at 5:50. The machine would come on. Wednesday, the cat would show up in the alley at 7:15. Mr. Hensley would come in with his crossword. Blythe would come by at 3, loud and eager, bringing all the ordinary bright noise of her life into this room the way she always did, and Maren would figure out the rest. One day at a time was not a philosophy, it was just survival. But survival, Maren had found, was often where the best things grew.